I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And we are Unholy, two Jews on the news from Keshet Podcast. Jonathan, your book is out. It's publication day. Oh my God, it's already on Amazon, #1 bestseller. This is amazing stuff.
Yeah, I'm sort of still a bit speechless about that, to be honest, because today is the publication day and you always imagine it being a long haul and quite a sort of long march to get people to notice a book and to talk about it. And it is literally #1 on the Amazon bestsellers list today. I've done a few interviews and, maybe people heard those and thought this sounds interesting. But I'm a bit blown away by it because I didn't think that would happen. I mean, sometimes when things like this are going to happen. I didn't have any idea this was coming. I didn't see this coming.
So we're going to tell our listeners that next week we're going to talk at length. We're going to do something we've never done before here on the podcast. I will interview you. So if I were you, I would be very prepared. That's all I'm saying.
I hear that you're a pretty tough interrogator. So when we come to talk about The Escape Artist by Jonathan Friedland, published by John Murray, now available, I fear I'm going to be grilled.
That was a very elegant plug-in, my friend. Very elegant.
We had to get that in. Yeah. No, look, you will talk about it properly next week. And I feel as if you have actually read it, but Unholy listeners have been sort of in on this process as it's been developing, because every now and again we have mentioned it, haven't we?
We have. Yep, we have. And so we're going to have this discussion about it next week. I think we talked about it before, but now that it's out in the world and you can actually physically buy a book.
That was the amazing thing when I sort of went into bookshops today, which I did to sign copies, and to see it as a real thing. It's quite a moment. It just is. I mean, there's something about it. It's your computer for hours, days on end, and documents and emails, and then suddenly it's an actual physical object. So, I could talk about it for a long time, but we are going to have a proper talk next week. This was one of these strange weeks, Yoni, where our sort of universes kind of weirdly merged, and there was this strange alignment of the stars, which I don't think we did particularly seen coming in advance, but on Monday night, it turned out that both of us simultaneously were waiting to see what the fate of the country's prime minister was going to be.
Exactly. I mean, there were two prime ministers who we should say are as different as can be, and both sharing a similar sinking feeling, kind of maybe watching power slip through their fingers. And we were both sort of getting these updates. It was in a 20-minute time slot where first it was Naftali Bennett who lost a vote, and we will talk about this at length in this episode, the cascading consequences of that vote. And then Boris Johnson actually, how should I say it, squeaking by a no-confidence vote?
Yes. I mean, if you were talking about any other British Prime Minister or any other Conservative Prime Minister who has faced votes of no confidence, and there have been a few, you would say he had been thoroughly humiliated in this vote. He got a worse worse result than Margaret Thatcher got in 1990, and that Theresa May got in 2018, John Major in 1995. These were terrible results for him. But because it's Boris Johnson, it kind of doesn't matter, because his own people were saying, as long as he wins by a single vote, that's enough. So normally you'd feel so humiliated that 148 of your own members of parliament, only Conservative people voting, by the way, this wasn't a general vote of the whole parliament. This was just his own political tribe. 148 of them out of 360 odd were saying, no, thanks, we don't want you as prime minister. And he thinks, yeah, fine, great, we survived. That a win's a win. And, this is a theme that we've talked about a bit in the Trump era as well. It's very difficult to deal with somebody who feels no shame or embarrassment, because normal politicians would feel humiliated by that. He doesn't feel that. He just thinks, fine, unless the rules tell me I've got to leave, I'm staying.
So it's not going to open the floodgates, right? You can't say for sure this is the beginning of the end, is what you're saying.
No, I don't think you can, because under the rules, he's safe for another year. That's one thing. They can always change those rules. But also a whole lot of the Conservatives are left thinking, well, now what? What do we do? And he thinks, well, unless you've got a candidate who can come forward and beat me, I'm fine. I'm still here. So they're all looking a bit stunned and shell-shocked. And yes, there are more blows to come, and that will drain away his authority. But in a way, those are kind of political metaphors. He just thinks, do I literally have the votes? If I do, I'm staying. And it does remind me a bit of how Trump was with, impeachment or even losing an election.
We have to read out the tweet by our political commentator, Amit Segal, who was on this program as well. He wrote, after both votes, he said, get a humiliating result in a confidence vote, but hold on at all costs. Break the law, but keep your head high. Blame your aides for your failures. Congratulations, Boris Johnson. You're Britain's first Israeli prime minister, which we both found quite amusing.
So good. I mean, that even made it here, actually. The Times newspaper here picked up on that and, reproduced that. It's such a clever observation. And, it appealed to me because do you remember those pieces that would say, Bill Clinton is America's first black president? And there was a cover story in a magazine in America that had Barack Obama as America's first Jewish president. So Boris Johnson being Britain's first Israeli prime minister, why not? If shamelessness is part of Israeli politics, then he, in committee room 10, where the Conservative Party met to get, to cast their votes, a result like this would have been shaming. But if he doesn't feel shame, it's all fine. So he just left thinking, yeah, fine, I'm still here.
So shall we continue from talking about, we don't know if it's the beginning of the end, but maybe the really end of the Israeli coalition, if we should kind of dive into that?
Let's dive into it, because this is something you have, you went out on a limb quite early on this and said it was the beginning of the end. The only issue was when, not if. And so are events vindicating that judgment?
I would say completely, because what happened this week, by the way, in 4 days from now, Jonathan, Naftali Bennett will mark a year in office, which is an incredibly tumultuous year, and I assume it won't be festive. But I am telling you, yes, I mean, in 2 words, I'm going to have a lot more than that coming up, but in 2 words right now, it's over. I mean, I'm saying that because the coalition this week lost in a vote that is essentially a technicality. It's just the extending of the law that extends Israeli law over the settlements in the West Bank. It's just a technicality to extend it. And the coalition lost, and it lost by a margin. It lost 52 to 58. So that says something about where it is. And even if they try and bring the bill again, this is not sustainable as a situation. Now, what is important to say here, just about timetables and timeframes. If Bennett somehow, and he's playing for time right now, if he somehow survives, again, this summer coalition, the elections in Israel are minimum 90 days. It's usually a little bit more than that. We can see elections in March. If it's shorter than that, if you have someone like Nir Orbach, who finally he's the weakest link in Yamina, in Naftali Bennett's party, breaking and saying, I'm going to be the 61st vote, we're going to dissolve the Knesset, you're going to have a shorter time frame. There's still high holidays, still 90 days, maybe elections in November. There's still a little bit of time, but not that much. So we're still driving on the road, but we see the dead end sign pretty clearly.
It's funny because things happen so swiftly here. As soon as there was talk of no confidence, the vote was that night. Everything moves very fast. The fact that Naftali Bennett is still there induces in me a kind of feeling of skepticism when people, including you, say, it's all over. Because I think, yeah, you said that, and look, he's still there, and he can still be there in June and August and October. And so you think, but actually, you're right. I mean, it is still over, even if it takes a very, very long time. But just as a matter of calendar politics, the fact that he seems to be on course to have made it a year, lots of people, including his predecessor, Bibi Netanyahu, said that would never happen. I seem to remember him talking about 3 weeks. It will be over in 3 weeks, he said. Right. And instead, he's still there. Also, there's that feeling with incumbents, which is as long as you're there, something might happen. Yeah,
but by the way, we're not sure that he's going to be there, because remember what might happen if the Knesset actually dissolves. Yes. And we keep saying this, but it's important to remind our listeners that if the people who vote to dissolve the Knesset, 2 of them come from Naftali Bennett's bloc, then Yair Lapid becomes the transition head of government. So everything you're seeing now on the chessboard is recalibrating itself to that. Yair Lapid is already planning his moves. Naftali Bennett is desperately trying to hang on. This is all the maneuvering of, again, the end of days of this coalition and looking forward to what will happen next. No one said that Israeli politics isn't interesting. But I wanted to, I do want to point out 2 things that happened on that vote on Monday, because it is indicative of a few things that are happening here. One is the fact, and this is really amazing, we talked about what this law is. it's the law extending Israeli law over these settlements in the West Bank. Now, what happened in this vote, Jonathan? The Bibi bloc, the right wing of the opposition, voted against this law, and the Israeli left voted for this law. This is like, again, Alice in Wonderland of Israeli politics. It's really incredible. We see this phenomenon around the world where the center doesn't hold, where there's a dichotomy and there's extremes and there's less and less reasons to cooperate, and the center can't find any sort of, you can't reach across the aisle and find reasons to cooperate. But here it's even more extreme, because can you imagine in the United States a situation where Democrats would vote against gun control or Republicans would vote against abortion restricting laws because they want to annoy the other side? I mean, really, this is pretty amazing. What the Bibi bloc thinks is that they're going to lose the battle, but they want to win the war. They want to hasten the dissolvement of this government.
You rightly say this was, procedurally speaking, a technicality, but the substance is really important. One of the big arguments made by those who want to, and we've talked about it on this podcast, put the apartheid label on Israel's presence in the West Bank and on the occupation, is to say the existence of two legal systems. That fact alone makes it, analogous to other unpalatable societies and regimes. And that's why it's so amazing that left parties like Meretz and others were voting to maintain that duality of legal system. You would think on principle they would say we can't do that. That is one of the big arguments about this issue, that it's so unjust that someone in Efrat who commits a crime faces the Israeli civil authorities, and someone in Ramallah a Palestinian town or village who commits any kind of offense has to be hauled before a military administration. And that difference, the idea of two legal systems in one land, depending in effect on your ethnicity, but on your citizenship, is seen as so invidious. And yet here it became this test with progressives voting to maintain it. So it is amazing. I do think about this, but just to sort of put down a marker about if it really is right that this government is in its death throes, even if they take a long time. Mm-hmm. I do wonder about what that will do in terms of global views of Israel, and particularly anti-Israel sentiment. It just strikes me that liberals around the world, I'm not talking about the far left who are really committed to the issue, but just general sort of liberal bien-pensant thinking around the world, has basically laid off Israel these last 12 months. It just hasn't, other things have been going on, but they've been giving a little bit of a free pass to Naftali Bennett, because the optics of this government, which does include Islamist parties, does include left parties, has sort of drawn the sting of some of the anti-Israel default feeling. And that's partly because in the previous period, and by previous period I mean 10, 12 years, Netanyahu was such a global hate figure, almost just a line you would throw in a speech along with Orban, Netanyahu, that it made it channeled a lot of negative energy, at the risk of sounding like Rebecca Newman from We Crashed. But it attracted that sort of attention. Without him there, people have been sort of gliding over it, not really looking, there's some vaguely centrist coalition thing going on. We can give it, we'll lay off Israel a bit. And I just wonder if this coalition does unravel, if there's a return of Likud and Netanyahu, you just might see an uptick in some of that anti-Israel sort of discourse, energy that has taken a sort of year-long holiday in the Naftali Bennett era.
Yeah, well, that it still might take a while, and there aren't any guarantees that Benjamin Netanyahu is the next prime minister. Obviously, he really wants to be, and it's going to be a fierce election campaign, but we really don't know what the next step is. And again, all likelihood, we're going to elections, and all likelihood, the next prime minister of Israel is Yair Lapid. So that changes a little bit what you're saying. Yair Lapid, because he's going to head the caretaker government going into elections.
By the way, just in terms of my point about sentiment, that would mean even more positive feelings while he's there, because he's branding. He doesn't have the back catalogue that Naftali Bennett has of no Palestinian state for 200 years. And he doesn't have lines like that in his back catalogue. Yep. He's got some, but nothing like. And therefore, the people who don't pay that much attention to Israel will think, they've got a proper centrist guy running that country. That's fine. Let me check out again and pay attention another 6 months. They won't know what you know about all the coalition machinations. They'll just think it's not Bibi. It's some guy who's vaguely centrist. let's talk about something else.
Yep. I want to kind of maybe point out something else that I found very interesting in this vote on Monday, because when it ended and some of the MKs that voted against it were from Ra'am, especially Mazen Ghanayem from the United Arab List, and Nir Orbach, who, as I said, is now the weakest link in Naftali Bennett's party, and everyone thinks he's the next to resign and leave the coalition, yelled at him at the end of the vote. He said, and I'll say this in Hebrew first, he said, Hanisui itchem nichshal. It means the experiment with you, the experiment of sitting with you in a government failed. Now, this is very important because even in 6 months from now or in a year from now, what will the actual ramifications of the fact that this government fell apart or began to unravel after a year, what will they be on Israeli society? Because we have to remember, this is Naftali Bennett, who came from the religious nationalist camp, the Jewish side, and Mansour Abbas, who came from the Islamist camp on his side, the Arab side. And they did something revolutionary in this, okay? And they kind of made this tectonic shift in Israeli politics. And when you think about it today, just this image, I was thinking about it today, if Naftali Bennett went to the Western Wall, he'd be heckled. And Mansour Abbas, if he went to Al-Aqsa, he would be heckled. So what they did was actually appreciated by everyone but the people who are supposed to be voting for them. And what does that mean next? Will the next government actually sit with Ram or not? That is a question, and I think the answer to that means a lot to Israel and to the Israeli society beyond the lifespan of this specific government.
I couldn't agree more. I think the diversity of this coalition means that something very important is at stake with its success or failure. But that line thrown across the Knesset floor of the experiment with you has failed, has it? I mean, I get the arithmetic point, the algebra of the coalition failed. But you tell me, in terms of public opinion, do people feel, not in terms of keeping up the numbers and balance of coalition, but as a project, do people feel this was a bad government? Do they feel it didn't work? Do they feel that Ram, the Islamist party, genuinely has no place in an Israeli governing coalition? Because those are different questions from whether or not it maintained its numbers.
Right. It's a very different question. Of course, what you asked is the important question and the salient point. Look, the minute Ram entered into this coalition, there were many parts of the opposition, especially the Bezalel Smotrich and parts of the Likud, who woke up and said, Ram are supporters of terror. It didn't matter. There's endless proof of the fact that Netanyahu himself wooed Ram, wanted to sit with them, suggested the moon, basically, for Mansour Abbas to be part of his coalition. The person who didn't agree to this was Bezalel Smotrich, I'll remind you. And now Netanyahu is denying the whole thing. It's kind of like the Kevin McCarthy tapes. It's like, sir, you did say these things about Trump. They're on tape. No, I didn't. It's the same kind of thing. The sort of denying the demonstrably true and obvious truth. So I think that if Netanyahu will turn around and suddenly need Ram and actually put them in the coalition, suddenly they'll be kosher. So it's a question. But yes, there are many parts of the Israeli society who think that because, and I remind you, this is part of the Islamist movement, part of the big umbrella that is the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's easy to say, yes, they are the moderates, but on the side, the most extreme side, there's Hamas. To make that connection is not too difficult, but I'll return to what you asked, what Mansour Abbas did, and I think that is the important part of his revolutionary, vision, was to say, I don't want to deal with anything that has to do with the Palestinian-Israeli issue. I just want to improve the lives of the Arab Israelis. Are you asking me if is it considered a success? I think some people think it is, and some people think it isn't, and that is the truth. And we will see if he does pass the electoral threshold these coming elections, whenever they may be, then that will be part of the answer to your question.
Yeah, and I would just say from outside Israel, to the extent that people have a view on the complexion of Israeli governments, I think this one, people have liked it, and people have liked the sort of rainbow coalition element and have wished it well. And so there will be some degree of, unhappiness if it comes tumbling down, and the narrative will shift. The narrative that Israel was moving on from the Bibi era will be unwound, I think, if this coalition crumbles, which, as you say, is probably a matter of time.
So So let's talk now about a topic that makes this country so unbelievably interesting, if we didn't convince you thus far. And that topic, Jonathan, is the integration of women into combat units in the IDF, in the Israeli Defense Forces. Now, this is what happened this week. The military had to respond to the High Court of Justice, to a petition signed by 4 women requesting to join special combat units, the most prestigious units of the IDF. We have to say a few things to set the stage on this. First of all, Israel obviously has a mandatory military service for men and women. As such, military is kind of the reflection of Israeli society, the army of the people, what we call tzva ha'am. And also, in many cases, kind of thrown reluctantly into the mix of having to solve Israeli society's problems and its culture wars. So, first of all, since about 2005, number of women in combat units increased to the extent that if we're talking about 2014, there are about 2,300 women in combat units. Today, there are about 6,500. That's about 18% of the combat range in the military. Now, this real revolution, and it is a revolution, what I just described, even in numbers, took place during the past decade, especially because of the women themselves. And we have to give them the credit for it. This is kind of a grassroots movement, if I can call it that, right? Women who decided that they want to have this kind of service, that they want to be in combat units, kind of knocking on the doors of the military and having the IDF chiefs of staff at the time, Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, allowing this to happen, but they were barred from the sort of frontline ground forces and combat elite units. That is what they were petitioning against now, saying just open up everything. Do it like the U.S. military. If we can handle it, just let us do it. Now, the military, I have to pause and say, is having a bit of an issue with this. First of all, it's saying we're going to do this slowly and we want to do it our way. We're very concerned about the health of these women as well, because they're giving out what the military, the IDF is doing here is showing you the statistics on women in the military in the U.S., saying, yes, they can go everywhere, but then they have a lot of health issues and problems because of the weight, because of the physical challenges. And they say that 50% of women in combat units in the U.S. Military actually drop out at some point, and they don't want that to happen. Also, they feel, and some of them were saying it quite clearly, some of the generals were saying, look, we are not what they would call, one of them said in an interview to me once, we are not the Ministry of Equal Rights. We don't have to solve everything and every problem that happens. We need to win a war. That's the most important thing. And you add to that, of course, the pressure from the rabbis of the religious nationalist movement who keep saying, because I described the uptick in women in combat units, there's also an uptick of religious men in combat units. They're saying this is not good for the men and we don't want this to happen and this is an issue, so please stop doing it at this rate. So this is where we are at this point. There's a lot more to say, and I can say what the military responded to that petition, but I think the whole issue itself is just so interesting in that kind of triangle between the military and the women and the religious part of Israeli society.
So just clarify one piece of this, which is, so yes, this increasing number of women in combat units, but were you saying that once they were in those combat units, they are not necessarily in frontline combat roles? They're in some other roles within the combat units?
They are fighter pilots, they are anti-aircraft, they're in artillery in some positions, they're in naval positions, but they won't essentially let them be what we call lochamei achod, which is sort of front line, first line of being the ground forces. That right. To this, and the elite units like Sayeret Matkal, that to this point has been closed off. And this is what women in combat units and women in general who are enlisting wanted to change. Now, the military is saying, you know what? We're not going to let you into the elites, but we are going to let you into certain units in the engineer corps and the reconnaissance Air Force unit. We're going to try a pilot for 2 years with a very limited number of women, which, to be honest, is a little bit like kicking the can down the road. But I do want to point out that the military, the IDF said, there's a criteria, a specific criteria for women who can go into these units that we will now allow them to. And I have to say this out loud because really it's pretty amazing. The criteria is that the female combat soldier who wants to go in has to be 78 kilograms and 166 centimeters in this. We're both from the metric system, but this means 171 pounds and a minimum of 5'4". Jonathan, if you can find any woman who's an athlete, 171 pounds and a minimum of 5'4", good luck to you. I just feel like that criteria for a woman to enter these units is that they should be a man. So this is the criteria that's set. That got a lot of criticism, for sure.
I'm looking, as you and I speak, at the cover of a book that was on the shelf of many a diaspora Jewish home in, certainly, I would say, the early 80s, maybe even a bit before. The book is called Daughters of Rachel, or Daughters of Rachel, Women in Israel, by Natalie Ryan. I'm looking at the cover again now because I remembered it and I wanted to see if I was right. But sure enough, what are the images on the cover of a book about women in Israel? There are two images. One is the face of Golda Meir, and the other is women in military uniform. And the point I'm making here is that for decades, I would say, in that period in which Israel was seen as some pioneering, progressive society, still in that pre-67 or just post-67 period where it was seen as the plucky David against the Goliath of its neighbors, part of the package, along with the kibbutz, things that people admired about Israel, one of them was this. It was the notion that it was some kind of feminist trailblazing society. That was part of the image making, that yes, it had the first woman prime minister when, other countries, Western democracies had not been led by women, but particularly this point about women in combat. It was picked up in all kinds of pop cultural ways. The female Israeli soldier, partly as being somehow kind of, I think there was, it gave a sort of frisson. There were sort of male commentators who found it kind of tittillating. The Israeli, the beautiful Israeli woman in uniform, that was a sort of trope. But also it was seen as feminist and because it was sort of hyper-egalitarian. Mm-hmm. So the idea this is now being pushed, a new frontier in this discussion, is to me interesting because it goes for something that was sort of part of Israel's identity. The other piece of it that I find fascinating, because we've talked about it, is this question of the rabbis and how much, pull, clout they have in Israel's society. We talked a few weeks back about abortion rights and how Israel had worked out a kind of package whereby there was lip service to approval, but actually in practice, you explained, it more or less always went through. There was no need for that sort of religious approval. And it seems to me an interesting test, yet again, of the strength of the religious establishment in Israeli life. If they object to women mixing with men in these combat units, do they get their way or not? Or will another classic status quo type fudge be brokered, whereby, women are in there, but not in there, so that the rabbis are happy?
No. So look, it's not a hoax. Women are in combat units and more so in Israeli military. To be quite clear, I think they won and the rabbis lost. Right. It's 88% of combat positions are open up to women. That means you have, as I said, women fighter pilots and naval captains and border police and aerial defense and some artillery units. I mean, they're almost everywhere. And they won because they decided to win, and they did this. Again, there's a lot more to be done, but I mean, this is an interesting story, and I just have to give you one statistic to answer your question about who won, is it the rabbis or not. Out of the women who are in combat units, 12% of them are religious women in combat units. Amazing. So they are upset. The rabbis are not only upset because they're scared of the men who will have to be in mixed units, but they're upset because they're losing the women. And that, I think, is an important point to make. Again, I feel like the military is, after, kind of pressing forward at this, is now kind of maybe pausing, thinking, but still, this is basically, I think, a change that is already completely out of the bag. It's happening.
I think that's completely fascinating. Putting it together with our conversation about abortion rights the other day, I think it does really paint a fascinating picture that for all the superficial indications and people talking about theocracy and all that, actually in day-to-day life, whether it's abortion rights or women in combat, that religious influence is waning and other norms are coming into play. By the way, just on the point about how that book cover was just seen as part of a package of things to admire about young, progressive, plucky Israel, how different that would be now about, there are not many progressives around the world who would want to cheer for women being in combat units in the IDF, because they would have to first say it's good being in the IDF, and they wouldn't necessarily want to say that. And so therefore there would be a clash between their feminism on the one hand and egalitarianism, and on the other hand, a kind of, recoil from the idea of Israel and its army. So I think probably you won't get many of those kind of magazine covers that we saw in the 70s and 80s. I don't think that will be happening anytime soon.
Still don't understand why we're plugging any book in this episode that isn't The Escape Artist. Like, why are we doing that?
Yes, The Escape Artist by Jonathan Friedland, available by John Murray. It is available in all good bookshops and indeed on import in Israel itself. Is that the one you meant? Sorry, I just wanted to clarify that. We should hand out some awards. So we should. I think you have a nominee for us.
I do. I like storytelling in our Chutzpah and Mensch Award. Like, I like it when someone falls from grace. Kind of like it. Like when someone who we once put in the Mensch category should know that they're never chutzpah-proof and they can find themselves one day in the chutzpah category. And I'm talking about former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who we've not only put in the Mensch category, but I think dedicated a whole episode to. I'm sure you remember this, Jonathan.
I do.
Episode 28. I know you do. I know you remember every
No, I couldn't have given you the number, but I do remember our conversation.
It was called Shalom, Farewell, Auf Wiedersehen, Goodbye. It was when she left office. And now she gave an interview to Der Spiegel. It's about 6 months after leaving office. And of course, someone who has been, we should say this, criticized in the past for, first of all, not only legitimizing Vladimir Putin, but making Germany more and more dependent on Russian energy and not stopping Putin, for example, when he annexed Crimea and all other issues. And she says there are two things that are pretty amazing. First of all, she says, I have no regrets. She explains everything that she thinks that she did, which was fine. No apologies, of course. But then she says something that caught my eye. And she says, the only language Putin understands is the language of force. Which is a little bit of a chutzpah here because, I mean, you're not just an analyst sitting in a studio and having this discussion about what do you think should or should not be done in Ukraine. You're actually someone who held the reins for 16 years and maybe could have used a little bit of the advice of the future Angela Merkel saying that Putin understands nothing but force. I mean, that's pretty remarkable.
I agree. It's a classic chutzpah. I think here's where we bring out the Aaron Sorkin, you think? I mean, Putin only understands the language of force. You think, Chancellor? Like, maybe you could have acted on that when you were in post. I mean, her stock has fallen so rapidly, more rapidly than an ex-leader that I can really think of in terms of the fall from major mensch in terms of all the obits we were included that greeted her departure, to now people thinking, oh, hold on a minute, she was a massive Putin enabler by cultivating this dependency on the narcotic of Russian oil and gas. So what you've just said there is fantastic. It's an exquisite chutzpah example. So that duly passes.
Yeah, and also proves the Arik Sharon famous adage that says no one ever regretted not giving an interview. So that also proves that, I think.
Yeah, no, he would definitely say that. But we don't want to spread that around because that would put both of us out of work. No, so that's excellent. That passes the committee without any disagreement at all. So we move to our Mensch Awards. I wanted to give a mention en route to Rabbi Pinchas Goldschmidt, who it seems was put under, he was the chief rabbi of Russian Jewry based in Moscow and came under big pressure after Russia invaded Ukraine in February, saying that he was put under pressure to essentially announce public support for the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and he wouldn't do it. And it's emerged that he has instead left the country. There's been back and forth about exactly when and what sort of pretext or whatever he gave. But I think it's an act of bravery to have done that. He served in Moscow for the last 33 years. He's the president of the Conference of European Rabbis, big respected figure. But when asked to toe the line and endorse Putin's invasion, said no. And that is a moral stand. So a mention for him. But I'm afraid the Mensch Award has to go to just one. I was going to say one person, but it's not really a person because the winner surely is a bear. The bear who took tea with Her Majesty the Queen. I think people have seen this video. It went viral. It kicked off the Platinum Jubilee celebrations last weekend. a video that had been made by the Queen. I mean, the Queen was really struggling to appear at some of these public events. She has mobility issues. She's 96 years old. It's difficult for her. But she had filmed this absolutely charming little video with Paddington, the two of them taking tea. Paddington lifts up the teapot and drinks straight from the spout. They talk about marmalade sandwiches. If you haven't seen it yet, find it. Paddington is just so totally adorable. Everybody loves him. He's so sweet. The actor Ben Whishaw does his voice, which makes him even cuter. Volodymyr Zelensky did his voice for the Ukrainian edition. But there is a Jewish connection here, which is that Paddington is in, and if you notice how Paddington is dressed with his little coat, and he used to have a bag with a little brown paper tag, a label. The story is that Paddington Bear was inspired, for the author Michael Bond, by the sight of young Jewish refugee children stepping off a train at Reading in the Britain, kinder transport children in the Second World War. The sight of those children arriving, little refugee children who were so sweet and so innocent, and yet really coming to this country as refugees from tragic circumstances, was the inspiration for Paddington Bear. Paddington Bear is a refugee, and people have been making the point that under current British government policy, Paddington wouldn't be having tea with the Queen. He would be being shipped to Rwanda and deported there. But Paddington brings out something. He is adorable, but he brings out something deeper about sympathy for refugees. So he is, I think, surely our Mensch of the week.
I agree. I think it's the first time we gave a Mensch award to a bear. So yay us.
Yeah, it's a first. Other bears, really, the award is yours if you make a good case.
Yeah, indeed. If you scale that height. We should wrap up our discussion for the week. We should say our thank yous, of course, to Gaia Glaser and Omer Primat and Rom Atik and Irad Eshel. Do you want to remind our listeners, Jonathan, of our Facebook group?
I do. You must join our Facebook group, Unholy Podcast, and the numbers really are growing. Do chime in there with ideas and opinions and thoughts for our episode. People have been doing that, sending questions you have. There is a conversation going on their Facebook group, Unholy Podcast. So do find us there. And of course, in all the usual places, rate, review. Many of you have been doing that, and that does help.
Great. And we shall meet next week, I think.
Well, I'm very looking forward to seeing, and I think we might talk about The Escape Artist.
Maybe.
Thank you, Yonit. It's been very good chatting. See you next week.
We'll meet next week.